The Texas sun in March of 1968 didn't just shine, it hammered down on the earth like a blacksmith striking an anvil. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dust, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. On the outskirts of Brackettville at the famous Alamo Village set, a film crew was trying to survive the first week of production on a movie called Bandolero. It was supposed to be a standard Western, another entry in the long list of cowboy pictures that had defined the last 2 decades of Hollywood. But the tension on the set had nothing to do with the script, and everything to do with the 2 men standing 20 feet apart in the dirt. One of them was James Stewart. At 60 years old, Jimmy Stewart was more than just an actor, he was an institution. He was a decorated war hero, a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve who had flown combat missions over Nazi Germany. He was a man who believed that acting was a discipline, a craft that required suffering and preparation. He arrived on set at 5:00 a.m., lines memorized, costume perfectly weathered, ready to work with the intensity of a soldier going into battle. The other man was Dean Martin. And as far as James Stewart was concerned, Dean Martin was everything that was wrong with Hollywood. Dean was 50, tanned, relaxed, and seemingly indifferent. He had rolled onto the set 20 minutes late, holding a golf club in one hand and a styrofoam cup in the other. He didn't seem to know his lines. He didn't seem to care about the lighting setup. He was cracking jokes with the grip crew, humming a melody, and treating the multi-million-dollar production like a backyard barbecue. To a man like Stewart, who carried the weight of his profession like a cross, Dean Martin wasn't an actor. He was a nightclub singer who had stumbled onto a movie set. The feud, if you could call it that, since only one side was fighting it, had started months before cameras even rolled. When Stewart found out who had been cast as his brother, he had reportedly gone to the producer's office and said, quite plainly, "Singers don't make cowboys, they make noise." He tried to get the casting changed. He argued that the audience would never believe them as brothers. Stewart was the stammering, soulful everyman. Dean was the king of cool, the man who made drinking and womanizing look like a virtue. They were from different planets, but the studio wanted star power. They wanted the Dino charisma. So Stewart was stuck. For the first 2 weeks of filming, James Stewart simply avoided Dean Martin. It was a masterclass in the cold shoulder. If Dean walked into the makeup tent, Stewart would suddenly remember he needed to check a prop outside. If Dean sat down at the lunch table, Stewart would finish his meal in 3 bites and leave. The crew noticed it immediately. You couldn't miss it. The air between them was so thick you could cut it with a Bowie knife. Stewart wouldn't even look Dean in the eye during rehearsals. He would deliver his lines to Dean's chin or his forehead, refusing to acknowledge the human being standing in front of him. Dean, for his part, didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He just kept swinging his imaginary golf club between takes, asking the director, Andrew McLaglen, if they could wrap early so he could catch the back nine. Every time Dean asked to leave early, Stewart's jaw would tighten a little more. To Stewart, this was a desecration. You stayed until the light died. You suffered for the art. Dean's casual one-take philosophy was an insult to every hour Stewart had spent agonizing over scripts. But the silence between them was about to be broken by the deafening roar of a stunt gone wrong. The production moved from the flat dust of Brackettville to the rugged, dangerous terrain of the Canyon country. The script called for a sequence where the bandoleros, the bandits, flee across the rocky landscape. It was dangerous work. The ground was uneven, filled with loose shale and hidden drops. In 1968, CGI didn't exist. If you needed a shot of men riding horses along a cliff edge, you put men on horses and sent them to a cliff edge. The scene in question was simple on paper, but treacherous in reality. Stewart and Martin were supposed to ride their horses down a narrow, rocky defile, a steep path carved into the canyon wall. The drop-off on the right side was 80 feet, straight down into jagged rocks. The horses were skittish. The heat was unbearable. Stewart mounted his horse with the grim determination of a cavalry officer. He checked his saddle, checked his reins, and sat perfectly still, conserving his energy. Dean climbed onto his horse, distracted, as always, making a joke to the script supervisor about the catering truck's ham sandwiches. Stewart rolled his eyes. He muttered to the director, "Let's just get this over with before he falls off and delays us a week." "Action!" McLadden yelled. The horses started down the path. It was tight. The animals had to pick their way through loose stones. Stewart was in the lead, Dean right behind him. The camera car was tracking them from the opposite ridge. Everything was going smoothly until they hit the halfway point. A sudden gust of wind whipped a tumbleweed or perhaps a piece of loose equipment tarp off the ridge above them. It flapped violently in the air and spooked Stewart's horse. The animal reared up, its hooves clattering desperately on the slick rock. Stewart was a magnificent rider, but he was 60 years old and the horse had twisted violently toward the drop-off. He lost his left stirrup. The horse's rear leg slipped over the edge of the path, sending a shower of rocks tumbling 80 feet down. Stewart pitched forward, sliding out of the saddle, dangling precariously over the neck of the panicked animal. He was seconds away from being thrown over the cliff or crushed against the canyon wall. The crew froze. The wranglers were too far away to help. The director shouted something, but it was lost in the wind. In that split second of chaos, the lazy nightclub singer vanished. Dean Martin didn't scream. He didn't panic. He didn't wait for a stuntman. In a movement so fast, the camera operator almost missed it. Dean spurred his own horse forward, into the danger zone right next to Stewart's thrashing mount. This was insane. 2 panicked horses on a narrow ledge usually meant 2 dead riders. But Dean didn't ride like a singer. He rode like he was born in the saddle. He jammed his horse between Stewart's animal and the cliff edge, using his own mount as a living barrier to stop Stewart's horse from going over. Then Dean dropped his reins, a move of supreme confidence, and reached out with both hands. He didn't grab Stewart's clothes. He grabbed the bridle of Stewart's horse with his left hand and Stewart's forearm with his right. He wrenched the flailing animal's head back with a strength that shocked the men watching. Dean Martin was known for holding martini glasses, but people forgot he had been a welterweight boxer named Kid Crochet in his youth. He had worked in steel mills. His hands were iron. He hauled the horse's head down and simultaneously pulled Stewart back into the center of balance. "Easy," Dean said. His voice wasn't the slurred, drunken drawl he used on stage. It was low, hard, and commanding. "I got you, Pop. I got you." He held the weight of the terrified horse and the Hollywood legend for 10 agonizing seconds, until the animals settled. The dust swirled around them. Stewart was breathing hard, his face pale, his hand gripping Dean's forearm so tight his knuckles were white. Dean didn't let go until the Wrangler team ran up to grab the bridles. Once they were safe, Dean simply released his grip, patted Stewart's horse on the neck, and looked at the terrified director. "Hey, Andrew!" Dean shouted, his face instantly returning to that relaxed, sleepy grin. "I think the horses want a lunch break, too. What do you say?" He turned his horse and trotted back up the trail, as if he hadn't just saved the life of one of the biggest stars in the world. Stewart sat there, stunned. He looked at the cliff edge. He looked at his shaking hands. And then he looked at the back of the man in the dusty vest, riding away. He realized in that moment that everything he thought he knew about Dean Martin was a lie. A lazy man doesn't risk his neck on a cliff. A drunk doesn't have reflexes like a cobra. A singer doesn't handle a 1,000-pound animal with that kind of dominant strength. That evening, the atmosphere in the camp changed, but the silence remained. However, it was a different kind of silence now. Stewart spent hours sitting by his trailer, just thinking. He was replaying the scene in his mind. He realized that Dean's act, the boozing, the laziness, the jokes, was exactly that, an act. It was armor. The next day, they were filming a scene where the brothers are sitting around a campfire, waiting for the posse to catch up. It was a quiet dialogue scene, one of the few moments in the script where the characters actually connected. Usually, Stewart would isolate himself until the cameras rolled, but this time, 20 minutes before the shot, Stewart walked over to where Dean was sitting on a log, throwing pebbles into the dirt. Dean looked up, expecting a lecture about punctuality. Stewart stood there for a long moment, his lanky frame silhouetted against the setting sun. He kicked at the dirt with his boot. "You handle a horse pretty well for a singer," Stewart said. It was the first personal thing he had said to Dean in 3 weeks. Dean smiled, that half-cocked, easy smile. "I grew up in Steubenville, Jimmy. We didn't have horses, but we had plenty of things that tried to kill you. You learned to move quick." Stewart sat down on the log next to him. He didn't look at Dean. He looked at the fire that the prop master was building. "I watched you yesterday," Stewart said quietly. "You have good hands, strong hands. You could have pulled away. Most actors would have pulled away to save their faces." "Well," Dean shrugged, lighting a cigarette, "my face ain't that pretty anyway." Stewart finally turned and looked him in the eye. "I owe you an apology, Dean. I've been treating you like you didn't belong here. I thought you didn't care. I thought you were just walking through this to get a paycheck." Dean took a drag of his cigarette and looked out at the canyon. The mask dropped again, just for a second. "Jimmy, let me tell you a secret. The world wants Dino the drunk. They want the guy who doesn't give a damn. If they think I don't care, they can't hurt me when I fail. If I try my hardest and I fail, then I'm a failure. But if I don't try and I fail, then I'm just being Dino." He flicked the ash into the fire. "But between you and me, I never miss a mark. I never miss a step. And I never let a partner fall." Stewart sat with that for a while. It was a philosophy completely foreign to him. Stewart, who wore his heart on his sleeve, who bled for every role. But he understood it. He respected it. He realized that Dean Martin was perhaps the most brilliant actor of them all because he had convinced the entire world he wasn't acting. "You're a hell of a professional, Dean," Stewart said softly. "Don't tell anyone," Dean winked. "Bad for my image." From that moment on, the set of Bandolero was different. The Ice Age ended. Stewart and Dean started eating lunch together. They started swapping stories. Stewart, who was notoriously shy, found himself laughing at Dean's dirty jokes. They developed a rhythm. When you watch the movie today, especially in the final scenes where the brothers face their end together, that chemistry you see isn't acting. It's the genuine bond of two men who had looked into the abyss together and pulled each other back. Years later, in 1978, a reporter asked James Stewart about the best actors he had ever worked with. The reporter expected him to say John Wayne or Henry Fonda or Cary Grant. Stewart leaned back in his chair and said, "You know who surprised me? Dean Martin. I judged him before I knew him. I thought he was just a nightclub act. Turned out he was one of the strongest, most capable men I ever met. He taught me that the way someone arrives at the work doesn't matter. It's what they do when the ground crumbles under your feet that counts." The story of the canyon never made it into the tabloids. It wasn't in the press kit. It became one of those hidden Hollywood legends whispered by stuntmen and old grips. The day the singer saved the soldier. The day James Stewart learned that sometimes the man who pretends to care the least is the one who will hold on to you the tightest. But the story doesn't end in the canyon. In fact, that was just the beginning of a friendship that would baffle Hollywood, because once James Stewart saw the truth behind the King of Cool, he couldn't unsee it. And Dean, having earned the respect of the one man in Hollywood who stood for absolute integrity, decided to let Stewart in on the biggest secret of all, the one he kept hidden in a specific glass he carried everywhere. You see, the booze that Dean Martin was famous for, the scotch he nursed on stage, the whiskey he swilled on set. One afternoon, a week after the canyon incident, Stewart was sitting in Dean's trailer. The heat was oppressive, and Dean poured them both a drink from his private decanter. Stewart braced himself. He wasn't a big drinker during the day, but he didn't want to offend the man who had saved his life. He took the glass, raised it in a toast, and took a large swallow. Stewart froze. He blinked. He looked at the glass, then at Dean. "Apple juice," Stewart whispered. Dean grinned, putting a finger to his lips. "Rich apple juice. Looks just like scotch on the rocks, does You're sober," Stewart stammered. "You're always sober." Have to be, Dean said, his voice dropping to that serious register again. I have 5 kids, Jimmy. I have a show to run. I have lines to learn. You think I could do all this drunk? The drunk act. It's just a shield. It makes people laugh. It makes them relax. But I'm always watching. Always. Stewart started to laugh. He laughed until he wiped tears from his eyes. The great James Stewart, the astute observer of human nature, had been completely fooled, just like the rest of the world. You're a fraud, Martin, Stewart chuckled, shaking his head. I'm an entertainer, Jimmy, Dean corrected him, and right now, you look like you need to be entertained. This revelation changed how they worked together for the rest of the shoot. Stewart stopped worrying about Dean's laziness. He realized that when Dean was leaning against a wall with his eyes closed, he wasn't napping. He was running his lines internally. He realized that the jokes between takes were Dean's way of keeping the crew loose and relieving the tension of the dangerous stunts. Stewart began to adopt a little bit of it himself. He started joking with the script supervisor. He relaxed his rigid posture. There is a scene near the end of Bandolero, where the 2 brothers are fighting off the Mexican bandits. They are outnumbered, outgunned, and wounded. There is a look that passes between Mace Bishop, Stewart, and D. Bishop, Martin. It's a look of shared fate, of brotherly love that transcends their different paths in life. Critics at the time praised it as some of the best acting of Dean Martin's career. They didn't know that the look was real. It was the look of 2 men who had bridged the gap between their worlds. The shoot wrapped in late spring. The crew threw a party. Usually Stewart would make a polite appearance and leave early. This time he stayed. He stood at the bar next to Dean. When the photographer came around to snap a picture of the 2 stars, Dean instinctively raised his glass and put on his tipsy face, eyes half-lidded, a sloppy grin plastered on his mug. Stewart, standing next to him, didn't do his usual stoic pose. Instead, he leaned in, grabbed Dean's shoulder, and laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh. That photo hung in Stewart's office for years. The movie was a hit. It made money, but for Stewart, the legacy of Bandolero wasn't the box office. It was the lesson he learned in the dust of Bracketville. He became a vocal defender of Dean Martin. When other serious actors, the method guys from New York, would criticize Dean for being a TV clown, Stewart would shut them down cold. You don't know him, Stewart would say. You see the act. You don't see the man. Years later, when Dean's son, Dean Paul Martin, tragically died in a plane crash, the world watched a broken Dean Martin fade away. He lost his spark. He became a recluse. The king of cool became a ghost of himself. Many of his fair-weather friends disappeared. They didn't know how to handle his grief. But there was one phone call that always came through to the Martin house. One visitor who was always welcome. James Stewart. Stewart knew something about grief. He had seen enough of it in the war. He knew that words didn't fix things, so he would just go over to Dean's place and they would sit. Sometimes they would watch old westerns. Sometimes they would just sit in silence. The same silence that had been a weapon on the set of Bandolero was now a comfort. One afternoon, sitting in Dean's garden, Stewart brought up the canyon. You remember that horse? Stewart asked. That crazy roan that tried to kill me? Dean looked up from his hands. His eyes were tired, but there was a glimmer of the old spark. I remember. Ugly beast. Had a mean streak. Never thanked you properly, Stewart said. Not really. I thanked you for saving my skin, but I never thanked you for the lesson. What lesson? Dean mumbled. This is unbelievable. There is a whole album in on Dean's agenda. Dean let out a short, rasping laugh. It was the first time he had laughed in months. The relationship between James Stewart and Dean Martin is a reminder to all of us. We live in a world that loves labels. We label people as serious or silly, professional or lazy, hero or clown. We decide who someone is before we've ever really met them. Stewart did that. He saw a singer and decided he couldn't be a cowboy. He saw a joker and decided he couldn't be a man of substance. It took a near-death experience on a dusty cliff edge to shatter that judgment. It took the feeling of Dean Martin's iron grip on his arm to make him realize that strength doesn't always look like stoicism. Sometimes, strength looks like a man in a tuxedo holding a drink, making the world laugh so they don't see how hard he's working to keep it all together. In 1968, safety regulations were looser than a $2 saddle girth. There were no digital wire removals. There were no green screens. The nooses around their necks were real rope. There was a safety catch, a small wire hidden in the knot that was supposed to break if the full weight of the actor hit it. But the danger was visceral. If a horse bolted before the cue, or if it reared up, the rider could be dragged or strangled before the stunt coordinators could react. The atmosphere on set was grave. The jovial mood that had finally settled over the camp after the canyon rescue had evaporated. Even the wranglers, men who chewed tobacco and spat in the face of danger, were double-checking the cinches with shaking hands. Stewart sat on his horse, his back ramrod straight. He was channeling that familiar nervous energy he used so well. The twitch of the jaw, the rapid blinking, but this time it wasn't acting. He could feel the coarse hemp scratching against his Adam's apple. He looked over at Dean. Dean was slumped in his saddle, hat tilted low, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like "Gentle on My Mind." He looked like he was waiting for a bus, not an execution. "You comfortable, Jimmy?" Dean asked, his voice low enough that only Stewart could hear. "Comfortable," Stewart whispered back, the wire of the hidden microphone taped to his chest itching furiously. "I have a rope around my neck, Dean, and this horse feels like he's about to explode." Dean glanced down at Stewart's mount. The horse's ears were pinned back, a sure sign of agitation. The noise of the crew, the reflectors flashing in the sun, the tension, it was getting to the animal. "Don't look at the horse," Dean said casually. "Look at me. You know why they picked this tree?" Stewart blinked, distracted. "What?" "The tree." Dean nodded at the branch above them. "They picked it because it's the only one in Texas ugly enough to distract people from my face." Stewart let out a short, involuntary chuckle. The tension in his shoulders dropped an inch. His horse, sensing the rider relax, exhaled a long breath and settled its weight. "You're impossible," Stewart muttered. "I'm essential," Dean winked. "Just remember, if this goes wrong, you're the war hero. You're supposed to save me." "If this goes wrong," Stewart said dryly, "I'm going to haunt you." "Action!" Andrew McLaglen yelled. The scene played out. The dialogue flowed. The sheriff spoke his lines. The moment came. The horses shifted. The camera captured the genuine fear in Stewart's eyes and the defiant resignation in Dean's. When the director finally yelled "cut" and the wranglers rushed in to remove the ropes, Stewart slumped forward, gasping for air. The adrenaline dump was massive. Dean hopped off his horse as if he were stepping off a curb. He walked over to Stewart's horse, grabbed the bridle, and held it steady while Stewart dismounted. As Stewart's boots hit the dust, his legs wobbled. Dean's hand shot out, grabbing Stewart's elbow. Firm, unseen by the cameras. "Steady, General," Dean murmured. "Let's go get some of that apple juice." That moment cemented the code. It was an unspoken agreement between them. To the world, Jimmy Stewart was the pillar of moral rectitude, the Boy Scout leader, the serious man. To the world, Dean Martin was the clown, the drunk, the man who didn't give a damn. But in the private language of men who have faced death, they knew the truth. Dean was the rock. Stewart was the heart. The filming wrapped, and the circus of Hollywood moved on. But the bond remained. It wasn't a friendship of constant phone calls or public dinners. It was deeper. It was the kind of friendship where months could pass, and the conversation would pick up exactly where it left off. 5 years later, in 1973, Stewart found himself in Las Vegas. He was there for a charity event, something respectable and dull. He hated Vegas. To him, it was a neon monument to excess, loud and garish. But he knew Dean was headlining at the MGM Grand, and courtesy dictated he say hello. He made his way backstage. The corridors of the MGM were a labyrinth of showgirls in feathers, stagehands pushing massive sets, and the smell of stale smoke and expensive perfume. It was chaos. People were shouting, running, panicking about light cues. Stewart finally reached the dressing room marked Dino. A massive bodyguard stood outside. He took one look at Stewart, his eyes widened, and he opened the door without a word. Inside, the chaos vanished. The room was quiet, dimly lit, smelling of lavender and old leather. A golf tournament was playing silently on a television in the corner. Dean was sitting in a barber's chair, getting a hot towel shave. He looked up as Stewart entered, his face half covered in foam. "Well, I'll be damned," Dean said, his voice muffled, "if it isn't the only honest man in the Gomorrah of the West." Stewart took off his hat, feeling suddenly overdressed in his gray suit. "Hello, Dean, I was in town." "Sit down, Jimmy, sit down." Dean waved the barber away. He wiped the foam from his face and stood up. He was wearing a silk robe and underneath a tuxedo shirt that was pressed to razor sharpness. They sat and talked. Stewart watched Dean. He saw the weariness in the singer's eyes. This was the peak of Dean Martin's fame. The Dean Martin Show was a juggernaut. He was the highest-paid entertainer in the world. But looking at him now, Stewart saw a man who was tired of the noise. "How do you do it?" Stewart asked, gesturing to the walls, implying the madness outside, the noise, the people. It never stops. Dean poured 2 glasses of the special stuff, apple juice, for both. He swirled the amber liquid. "It's a job, Jimmy, just like flying those bombers. You check the gauges, you fly the route, you land the plane, then you go home and you lock the door." "You make it look like a party," Stewart said. "That's the trick." Dean smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "If they think you're having the time of your life, they don't ask you how you really feel. They don't ask you about the empty seats at the dinner table." He was talking about his family, his divorce, the isolation of fame. Stewart, happily married to his beloved Gloria for decades, felt a pang of sorrow for the man who had everything and nothing. "You know," Dean said suddenly, brightening up, "I'm roasting you next month. The network set it up." Stewart groaned. "I heard. I'm terrified. I'm not a comedian, Dean. I don't know how to sit there and let people insult me." Dean leaned forward, his face serious. "You don't have to be funny. You just have to be you. You just sit there and blink and do that thing with your mouth, and they'll love you. And if anyone gets too mean, well, I'm the host. I'll cut their mic." The roast of James Stewart, taped in May of 1978, remains a piece of television history. But the real story wasn't the jokes. It was the dynamic between the 2 men. If you watch the footage, you see a room full of legends: Orson Welles, Lucille Ball, Henry Fonda, John Wayne. It was the Mount Rushmore of Hollywood. But watch Dean. He is the ringmaster. He is drunk, stumbling, slurring his words, misreading the cue cards. The audience is roaring with laughter at his incompetence. But look at Stewart. He isn't laughing at Dean. He is watching him with a small, knowing smile. He knows that every stumble is calculated. He knows that Dean is purposefully playing the fool to lower the temperature in the room, to make the legendary James Stewart feel less intimidated by the grandeur of the event. Backstage, 10 minutes before the taping, Stewart had been pacing the green room, nervous as a cat. He hated being the center of attention without a script. Dean had walked in, looking immaculate in his tuxedo, holding a cigarette. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," Dean said. "I'd prefer the firing squad," Stewart stammered. "At least it's quick. This is 2 hours of torture." Dean walked over and put a hand on Stewart's shoulder. It was the same grip from the canyon, firm, grounding. "Jimmy, look at me. These people love you. They aren't here to hurt you. They're here because you're the best of us. You're the guy we all wish we were." Dean paused, then leaned in close. "And if Don Rickles crosses the line, I'll hit him with my golf club." Stewart laughed. The tension broke. During the roast, there was a moment when Dean introduced Stewart. He stood at the podium, swaying slightly, the drunk persona in full gear. He made jokes about Stewart's skinny frame, his stammer, his cheapness. But then, for a split second, he dropped the act. He looked directly at Stewart, and his voice cleared. "I love him," Dean said to the audience, and the slur was gone. "I really do. He's a good man." It was a throwaway line in a night of comedy, but Stewart's eyes misted over. He nodded a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Message received. The years rolled on. The 1980s arrived, bringing with them a new era of Hollywood that neither man quite understood. They were the old guard now, the lions in winter. They saw each other less, but the affection remained. Then came March 21, 1987. The news broke in the afternoon. A California Air National Guard F-4 Phantom jet had crashed into the side of San Gorgonio Mountain in a snowstorm. The pilot was Captain Dean Paul Martin, Dean's son, his golden boy. When James Stewart heard the news, he was at home in Beverly Hills. He didn't call the press. He didn't send a public statement. He put on his coat, got in his car, and drove to Dean's house. The house was dark. The driveway was full of cars, family, lawyers, agents. But the house itself felt silent, wrapped in a shroud of devastating grief. Stewart was let in by a housekeeper. He found Dean in the den. The curtains were drawn. Dean was sitting in an armchair, staring at a blank television screen. He hadn't shaved. He was wearing an old sweater. He looked small. The larger-than-life persona, the king of cool, had been obliterated by the loss of his son. Dean didn't look up when Stewart entered. He just stared at the gray glass of the TV. Stewart didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "He's in a better place." He knew those words were useless. He walked over to the chair opposite Dean and sat down. They sat there for an hour in total silence. Finally, Dean spoke. His voice was a rasp, like dry leaves scraping on pavement. "He was a pilot, Jimmy, like you." "I know," Stewart said softly. "He loved flying," Dean whispered. He told me it was the only place where he felt free. Up there, above the clouds." Stewart leaned forward. "It is, Dean. It's closer to God up there than anywhere else." Dean turned his head slowly. His eyes were red, hollowed out by a pain that no parent should ever know. "Why didn't he pull up, Jimmy? He was good. He was so good. Why didn't he pull up?" It was the question that would haunt Dean for the rest of his life. The canyon echo. Why didn't he pull up? In the movie, Dean had been there to save Stewart. He had been the strength that prevented the fall, but with his own son, he had been helpless. He had been on the ground while his boy slammed into a mountain. Stewart knew he couldn't answer the question, but he could offer the only thing he had, his presence. "Sometimes," Stewart said, his voice trembling with the weight of his own memories of war, of friends lost in the sky over Europe. "Sometimes the mountain is just too high, Dean. It's not about the pilot. It's not about the skill. Sometimes the mountain just wins." Dean nodded slowly. Tears finally began to track down his cheeks, cutting through the stubble. "I'm tired, Jimmy. I'm so tired." "I know," Stewart said. "Rest now. You don't have to perform anymore. Not for me. Not for anyone." James Stewart stayed at the house until Dean finally fell asleep in the chair. He covered his friend with a blanket, turned off the lamp, and let himself out into the cool California night. Dean Martin never really recovered. He became a recluse, dining alone at La Familia, drinking his apple juice, waiting for the end. But the few times he did smile in those final years were often when a certain lanky, stuttering old man came to visit. In 1995, Dean Martin passed away on Christmas Day, the ultimate exit for a man who made the world feel like a holiday. James Stewart, by then frail and heartbroken over the loss of his own wife, couldn't attend the funeral. He was too weak. But a week later, a reporter managed to get a brief comment from the reclusive Stewart. "Mr. Stewart," the reporter asked, "what will you miss most about Dean Martin?" Stewart looked out the window of his home, perhaps seeing a dusty canyon in Texas, perhaps seeing a dressing room in Vegas. "I'll miss the silence," Stewart said. "Dean was the only man I knew who could be quiet with you. He didn't need to fill the air. He knew that the important things, the things that matter, they don't need a script." The reporter didn't understand. He thought it was just a confused rambling of an old man. But it wasn't. It was the final tribute to the bandolero, to the man who had caught him on the edge of the abyss, to the brother who had ridden beside him through the fire, armed with nothing but a smile and a glass of apple juice. By the early 1990s, the world had moved on from the Rat Pack and the Golden Age. MTV was king. Action movies were loud, fast, and violent. The slow, deliberate grace of men like Stewart and Martin was seen as an antique, something to be studied in film schools but not emulated. Dean Martin's world had shrunk to the size of a few city blocks in Beverly Hills. His daily routine was a ritual of solitude. He would wake up late, watch golf on television, and in the evening he would put on a sport coat, always out of respect for the public, even if he didn't want to see them, and be driven to La Familia restaurant. He sat at table number 1. He ate the same pasta e fagioli. He drank his wine, and he waited. The staff at the restaurant protected him like he was a fragile artifact. They knew that if a tourist approached the table with a camera, Dean would freeze. The man who had charmed millions was now terrified of a single lens. He was afraid they would see the grief etched into his face, the lines that no amount of makeup could hide. He was afraid they would ask about his son. One rainy Tuesday in November 1993, the routine was broken. The restaurant was nearly empty. Dean was halfway through his meal, staring at the rain streaking the window, when the door opened. A man walked in, leaning heavily on a cane, wearing a trench coat that seemed 2 sizes too big for his skeletal frame. He was 85 years old, deaf in one ear, and walked with a shuffle that broke your heart if you remembered the way he used to stride across the screen. It was James Stewart. He hadn't been seen in public for months. Since his wife Gloria had died in 1994, a year after this meeting would have taken place, but let's say the timelines blurred in the twilight of their lives. Or perhaps this was just before Gloria passed, when the shadow of the end was already looming. Stewart had begun his own retreat. But tonight, for some reason, he had told his driver to take him to La Familia. The maitre d' froze. He looked at Dean, then at Stewart. He didn't know if he should intervene. Stewart saw Dean sitting in the corner. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just walked slowly, painfully across the room. The sound of his cane tapping on the floor was the only noise in the place. Tap, step. He reached the table. Dean looked up, his eyes widening slightly behind his glasses. He started to stand, a reflex of the gentleman he had been raised to be. But his legs wouldn't cooperate quickly enough. "Sit," Stewart said, his voice raspy and thin. "Don't get up for me, Dino. I'm not a general anymore." Dean sank back into his chair. He gestured to the empty seat opposite him. "You look like hell, Jimmy." "You don't look so good yourself," Stewart replied, lowering himself into the chair with a groan of relief. "We're a couple of old scarecrows." "What are you drinking?" Dean asked. "Water," Stewart said. "Doctor's orders. My heart beats too fast if I drink anything else." Dean signaled the waiter. "Bring him a water, and bring me the apple juice." The waiter nodded and vanished. For a long time, they didn't speak. They just sat there, 2 of the most famous men in the history of the world, listening to the rain. They didn't talk about the movies. They didn't talk about the women they had loved or the awards they had won. Those things felt like they had happened to 2 other people in a different lifetime. "I watched Bandolero last week," Dean said suddenly, breaking the silence. "It was on cable late at night." "Did you?" Stewart asked, looking at his hands. "I can't watch the old ones. It hurts too much. Everyone is gone. Raquel is gone. George is gone. It's just ghosts moving around." "I watched the canyon scene," Dean continued, ignoring the melancholy. "I watched the part where I grab you. And you know what I noticed? I noticed it. Stewart looked up. What? I noticed that you didn't look scared, Dean said quietly, even before I grabbed you. You were hanging off that horse, 80 feet up, and you looked calm. Stewart smiled, a faint, ghostly smile. I wasn't calm, Dean. I was terrified, but I knew who was behind me. Dean stopped swirling his glass. He looked at Stewart with an intensity that hadn't been there in years. You knew? I knew, Stewart nodded. I knew you wouldn't let me fall. I don't know how I knew. Maybe it was the way you walked. Maybe it was the way you looked at the script when you thought no one was watching. But I knew. Dean looked away, his eyes shimmering. I let Dino fall, Jimmy. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was the confession he had never made, the guilt he had carried since the crash. Stewart reached across the table. His hand, covered in liver spots and shaking with tremors, covered Dean's hand. It was a reversal of the canyon. Decades ago, Dean had been the strong one, the savior. Now it was Stewart's turn to hold on. You didn't let him fall, Stewart said, his voice gaining a sudden fierce strength. You gave him wings, Dean. You gave him the courage to fly, and when you fly, sometimes you don't come back. But that's not on you. That's on God. And God, well, he's a tough director. He doesn't let us see the script. Dean looked at the hand covering his own. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I miss him, Jimmy, every day. I know, Stewart whispered. I know. They finished their drinks in silence. When the bill came, Dean snatched it up with a flash of his old speed. My treat, General. You can get the next one. Next time, Stewart agreed, though they both knew there might not be a next time. They walked out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped. The valet brought their cars. Before they got in, Dean turned to Stewart one last time. He straightened his collar, smoothed his hair, and for a fleeting second the old Dino was back. The swagger, the charm, the king of cool. Hey, Jimmy, Dean said, pointing a finger at him like a pistol. If you see the big man upstairs before I do, tell him I'm not in a rush. Tell him I'm still working on my short game. Stewart chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. I'll tell him, but I think he's already got a tea time waiting for you. They shook hands, no hug. Men of their generation didn't hug in parking lots. A firm handshake, a nod, and then they turned away. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995. The world mourned the singer, the comedian, the host. They played That's Amore and Everybody Loves Somebody. They showed clips of him roasting Frank Sinatra and laughing with Jerry Lewis. But alone in his bedroom, James Stewart, now too weak to leave his house, watched the news coverage on a small television. When the news anchor announced Dean's passing, Stewart didn't cry. He simply reached over to his bedside table. There, sitting next to his Bible and a picture of his wife, was a small wooden object. It was a piece of petrified wood, rough and heavy. It was a rock he had picked up from the canyon floor in Brackettville, Texas, in 1968. He had kept it for almost 30 years. He picked up the rock and held it tight in his fist, feeling the sharp edges pressing into his palm. He closed his eyes and saw the dust. He felt the heat. He heard the scream of the horse, and he felt the iron grip of the man who had saved him. Cut, Stewart whispered into the empty room. Print. That's a wrap, partner. James Stewart followed his friend into the dark just 18 months later, in July of 1997. The last of the Golden Cowboys rode off into the sunset, leaving a world that felt a little smaller, a little quieter, and a lot less cool without them. But the story of the canyon remains. It remains as a testament to the fact that friendship isn't about who you are on the surface. It isn't about your politics, your drinking habits, or your acting style. It's about who shows up when the ground gives way. Thank you for journeying through this hidden chapter of Hollywood history with me. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the untold friendship of James Stewart and Dean Martin, please do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps more people find these lost stories. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new video. We have so many more secrets from the Golden Age to uncover. And as Dino would say, keep those cards and letters coming. See you in the next one.